dyslexia. Dyslexia is commonly misunderstood, and it's been historically misunderstood. When I first moved to Queensland 15 years ago, you didn't mention the D word. It wasn't actually an accepted disability here within Queensland. It wasn't something we talked about. And I arrived and I said, I'm a dyslexia specialist. And they said, well, don't mention that word. We don't have children with dyslexia here, which was never the case. And people in the real world on the ground knew that we had children who had literacy difficulties. So it affects about 1 in 10 children. So that's probably 3 children in every class. So it's really common. It's a really common difficulty, and it's, for most children, it can be overcome relatively easily with some specialist tutoring. For some children, it can be massively impacting, and they need additional supports as well. And thank goodness we're in the 21st century, and there's so much technology out there that children can use to help them to overcome or remove those barriers to their literacy. Interestingly, it's about 2 to 3 boys to every girl that is diagnosed with dyslexia. And if a parent has dyslexia, then the chances are they possibly will pass that on to their children. So how do you get a formal diagnosis of dyslexia? Well, this really needs to be done by an educational psychologist. There are many people out there who will say, yes, your child's dyslexic, but is it actually a recognised person that is actually saying that? As a specialist teacher, I could do some assessment and say, I think your child's dyslexic, but it won't be formally recognised, and therefore it's not okay for me to do that. I would need to say, I'm concerned that this is the case, and send you off to the correct specialist to get the correct assessments done, so we get a correct diagnosis, because there are other things that could also be influencing that, which I don't have access to testing for. So dyslexia in the DSM-5, the most recent diagnostic statistical manual, which is where we get those diagnoses from, removed the word dyslexia and called it a specific learning disorder. So you will get a diagnosis that says something like a specific learning disorder with impairment in reading, a specific learning disorder with impairment in writing. You may even get something like a specific learning disorder with impairment in reading accuracy, or reading rate, or reading fluency, or reading comprehension. So they've taken it from just dyslexia and made it a lot more specific. So if you're the person who's now going to do the follow-up tutoring, the follow-up support, the follow-up teacher, then you know exactly what to focus on. So it says child has difficulty with reading accuracy, that's what you focus on. If it says the child has difficulty with reading comprehension, that directs you to focus on something completely different. You may need to do a little bit of the other things as well as part of that child's development. But certainly the new diagnostic criteria is slightly different, and I think is quite a lot more helpful. You could also have a child under the specific learning disorders who may have dyscalculia or dysgraphia, and they could be alongside the dyslexia or independent of the dyslexia. So dyscalculia is problem with maths, and dysgraphia is problem with writing. You've got the ideas, but you can't get them down on the paper. So before your child is diagnosed, it's really important that they've had 6 months of intervention of an appropriate evidence-based or research-based program. This is important because we need to show that there isn't a problem because they just haven't done it, or there's a problem because they just took a little bit longer to get there, which for some children is just naturally the case. We have a range of different ages and different abilities in a class. Is it dyslexia, or is it just they're learning at their own pace? So it's really important that we give that child that intervention first, and that's something you need to ask your school, have they done, what are they doing, so that it helps make that clear diagnosis of dyslexia, because we don't want to diagnose dyslexia and then find out actually it wasn't that at all, it was something else. And that happens from time to time, and that can happen as children change, and although the diagnosis theoretically is for life, occasionally there will be times where things were missed in the early years and the diagnosis turns out not to be quite correct and we have something else slightly different. So when you get your diagnosis, it will have mild, moderate or severe, and that's how much it's going to impact your child in school. If it's only mild, they'll get through school with a little bit of extra help. If it's moderate, they're going to need a fair bit of help. If it's severe, some of those children will actually get to a point where learning to read is almost impossible, and they will need very, very specialist intervention, and they will need lots of technology to support them to access. They may be incredibly clever, but they'll find that process of reading and spelling really difficult. But as I said before, this is the 21st century. We have masses and masses of really good technology out there. Currently I'm working with a student who uses a program called Dragon, which is speech to text, which is absolutely amazing in what he can do. He writes sentences that he could never spell, but he has the IQ to come up with great sentences. So that will also be explained by the psychologist who does your assessment. And finally, I just wanted to mention, once you have a diagnosis, it's really important that you choose an appropriate program. An appropriate meaning it needs to be based around the Orton-Gillingham, which is the gold standard, but there are other programs other than Orton-Gillingham now that use the same approach, but it needs to be explicit, it needs to be systematic, it needs to be multisensory, it needs to be cumulative, so it continues on from what you've done before. You never ask a student to do something you haven't taught them, is basically the principle behind it. And there's a very set procedures that you go through to make sure they've got the learning and the learning is secured. So there are lots and lots of interventions out there. There's some really glossy ones. If you just search dyslexia programs, there are loads. But do they have an evidence base? Do they have research base? And that's really, really important, because you don't want to be spending thousands and thousands of dollars on a program isn't going to work. And over the years there have been many of these that have been totally discredited because they actually took your money and they had no research base to back that. So do your research. Please contact me if you'd like some help to do some good research. I have included on my blog post a link to a list of approved courses or programs that are used by Speld here in Australia, so that might give you a guidance on where to get started with good quality appropriate programs. I hope that helps. Dyslexia is a really complex issue and attached to lots of controversy about whether it even exists or not. Yes, it does. But how you treat it and the different types can be very confusing. So keep it simple and do what's best for your child.